Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your meal. We're going to start. I'm the storytellers of the storytellers' stories. I'm here today attempting to give an introduction. Think about it. These layers of the furry relationships are actually within us throughout the entire conference today and just resurface once every a while. But I would like, firstly, to introduce you the two real storytellers, Vincent Normand and Chris Fitzpatrick. Vincent Normand is a writer and curator living in Paris. His curatorial projects include the exhibition Sinking Islands in Labor, Mexico City in 2012, and Femme Palace at Centre Pompidou in Paris in 2010, and exhibition The Serene Stage, which was presented at 3 different venues, including the David Roberts Art Foundation in London, Kadist Art Foundation in Paris, and Norma Foundation in Rome. He is co-director of Glass Bead, a forthcoming journal and international research laboratory, and his texts are published in various collective publications and magazines. His current researches focus on relocating the history of exhibitions in the broader field of a history of observation. Chris Fitzpatrick is the director of Objectif exhibitions in Antwerp, where he developed a 4-year program of spontaneous and overlapping solo exhibitions, which are presented at differing physical and temporal scales, and with correspondingly different levels of mediation. Fitzpatrick has curated exhibitions and events internationally, including Vera at Fondazione San Rato Re Ribadengo, I tried, in Turin, the San Francisco Pavilion of the 9th Shanghai Biennial in Shanghai in 2012, and Present Future section at Altissima 18 in Turin. His writing has been published in Spike, Pathmaker, Nero, Moose, Philip, Cura, the Baltic Notebooks of Anthony Blunt, art papers, exhibition catalogs, and books. So, the story starts with a metaphor brought forward by the odd crustacean parasite, Cymothoa exigua, the town-eating louse, known as the only parasite that can replace an entire organ. It enters through a fish's gill and then hooks its claws at the base of the fish's tongue to interrupt the blood flow. Due to the lack of blood, the fish's tongue ultimately falls off, allowing the parasite to effectively replace it. Before we go on, let's rewind a little bit and return to the point before the story even began. Before the word tongue carries so many layers of cultural metaphors, to the moment when the tongue is still a tongue in its most corporal notion, a key gustatory and speech organ. It is precisely these doubled functions and abilities of the specific organ that have created the context of this long history of symbolic significance and philosophical resonance. Immanuel Kant was fascinated with arranging dinner parties, during which he would pose the questions of why aesthetic awareness was called taste. When a meal was being served and consumed, a heated discussion was also undergoing. Here, the human tongue's capacity to sense flavor and its linguistic function perfectly converge, foregrounding itself as the site where the relationship between the concept of taste and the discourse of aesthetics start. However, for Kant, taste can never be viable as aesthetic experience only when it transcends the sensory pleasure of eating and is communicated in language. The direct physical and bodily relationship when we had with the food is thus cut off, because only when we are able to describe what we're eating in words, the experience would be eligible or convincible. In Vincent Normand's presentation to the Planetarium, The Mute Things Speak to Me, he will analyze how such a process is actually a clinical operation of objectification in the scheme of modernity. Objects are firstly considered mute and passive, By doing so, this clinical procedure then is able to provide them with the ability to speak through the writing and speech mechanism, or in other words, to signify through different modes of representation, to be inhabited by a synthetic voice, and ultimately, in the order of significations, the presence of objects reside in the relation amongst signs. In clinical terms, this is a graft, a transplant of sorts, that of a synthetic tongue on the object. Through investigating the modern cosmology, taxonomy, a central methodology of museums to constitute modern episteme, Vincent Normand will make explicit the clinical gesture and the technologies of the gaze that endow the nature world with the power of speech by navigating on the edge of the dialectics between orientation and disorientation. In a much smaller cosmos of the art world, art objects are also made to speak within the institutional framework through a tongue consists of a variety of informational modes, including curatorial procedures, press releases, publications, and wall texts. By reproducing an ideological network of policies, tastes, and positions, the institution's voice creates authorial power over art objects or even artists. What will happen if an institution disowns its tongue, or if its tongue is being replaced by a parasitical practice? Can an artist or a curator be a parasite and the institution is the host, so to speak? Can a mouth without a tongue be compared to a body without organ, which is continuously dismantling and deconstructing the mechanism of speech and power positions, causing words to pass or circulate with no intention or representation? Or if modes of interpretation does not actually intend to make explicit, to articulate, to decipher, to establish arguments, and to convince, but instead to expand potentials through creating confusions, a kind of productive confusion. A parasiticized tongue, after all, is no longer a tongue, but a prosthesis. What happens when the role of the object or the artwork and the spectator invert? Why not allow sculptures, for example, to speculate on the world of humans? What will happen if the speakers actually speak? Can a section of the conference become a para-narrative that penetrates into the body of the whole conference? The story will then continue with a voice enunciating a chain of text fragments, transcriptions, data, institutional documents, scores, keywords, time signatures, quantifiable statistics, and other materials collated by Chris Fitzpatrick in collaboration with the mouth, some ventriloquists, several philosophers, a few artists, an Amazonian freshwater parasitical catfish, and the town-eating louse. My introductory gesture and attempt probably stop here. Just one last thing though. The complex relationship between the tongue and the taste is perhaps further intensified when considering the former is actually a delicious dish of many, other than the tongue-eating louse. During a TV interview with Claire Parnett in 1988 and 89, Gilles Deleuze named 3 of his favorite things to eat. Tongue was among one of them, the other 2 a brain and marrow. Regarding these 3 sublime things, Deleuze further made an analogy that constitutes a kind of trinity: the brain as the concept, marrow as the effect, and the tongue as the percept.
Thank you, Xiaoyu, for inviting me first and for this introduction full of cookery metaphors. It's after all digestion time for us now. I'll try to keep you as awake as possible. What I want to do now is to address the question raised by this conference from a historical and genealogical perspective. If one wanted to produce a generic definition of an exhibition, one could do worse than arguing that an exhibition consists in a sort of purification machine where every object becomes a form, where every gesture becomes a signifier, a sign carrying meaning. A space where visibilities produce discursivity, where objects and speech seem to be bound and fastened by an aesthetic and relational field that is primarily semiotic. So well that the exhibition seems to be the site where the coextensivity of matter and meaning, the correlation of objects and speech, is given. The entanglement of the domain of the object and that of speech or meaning could be said to be merely the question of representation in a way. And as such, it can be said to be the sleight of hand of modernity, or what Michel Foucault identified as being buried in the deep of the epistemological mechanisms of what he calls the age of representation, modernity. The same way an object becomes an evidence in an investigation, a thing becomes a representation as soon as it points beyond itself, as soon as it works as the index of a larger, more abstract or elevated realm whose identity requires language to be nominated, to be grasped by thought. And I'd like to provide us today with an inevitably lacunal, but hopefully cogent genealogy of the process by which, so to speak, text slipped inside the body of things. And to do that, we need to reinscribe the question of exhibition in the broader history of the apparatuses of observation and knowledge, and in the history of the technologies of the gaze that supported them. And we need to operate some kind of vertical descent to plunge deep in the mechanisms by which we came to consider the object as the site of production of speech. And what I'd like to do is to describe the geometry of the space in which appeared the episteme, the order of knowledge we inherited from modernity. And to do that, I'll focus on a historical rupture, a break between, on the one hand, a pre-modern epistemological configuration where the domain of text, speech, and meaning is embedded, in a way, in the world of objects, and on the other hand, a modern configuration in which this continuity between speech and object is not given anymore and has to be made explicit by synthetic means. And eventually, as we'll go in the presentation, I hope we'll understand maybe how this question of the talking object or the meaningful object got tied to the most demanding epistemological and cosmological questions of the time. So first I tried to determine a generic speech-object relationship, say a Western pre-modern cosmography. And I start with this image that is a collection of chimeras that is taken from the first book of natural history written by the inventor of the discipline, Ulisse Aldrovandi, in 1595. Aldrovandi is an Italian naturalist and one of the first European men of learning to gather his collection of naturalia in a cabinet in Bologna, in Italy, a cabinet that he calls his museo. At that time, Europe is basically undergoing a pre-industrial revolution. The printing machine, the import in Europe of Oriental manuscripts, or the apparition of a literature that is not made exclusively for the voice anymore, make of language somehow an element which main and primary feature is to be written. This new privilege of writing that anticipates the modern era in a way culminates at the end of the 16th century with the apparition with people such as Aldrovandi of the beginning of the encyclopedic project that is in its most generic definition the enterprise of reconstitution of the order of things by the linguistic sequencing of rubrics, categories, text, and words. And this encyclopedic project is first enacted in the cabinets of curiosities, such as Aldrovandi's one. By lack of a good quality image of Aldrovandi's cabinet, I chose this one that is a contemporary cabinet with which I suppose most of you are familiar. It's the one of the Napolitan apothecary Imperanto Ferrante. There's been a lot, I mean, let's say too much literature on the cabinet of curiosity, especially in curatorial studies. It might correspond to some kind of reactionary trend, a fascination for the motifs of classification. But I feel that often the point of the cabinet is missed somehow. Because the interesting point here is precisely that it appears to be the first institutional frame in which is organized the alliance of the two of the concepts we are interested in today, objects and speech. Here the cabinet operates somehow like a global isolator for objects. But in these very early days of the encyclopedic project, the epistemological configuration that supports the cabinet is still absolutely tied with mystique beliefs. Indeed, this very rich microcosm of objects tends to establish a relation to nature, a nature that is highly didactic, entirely inhabited by some kind of proliferating truth. The nature that is mirrored by the cabinet and by Aldrovandi's natural history is a nature that is entirely written. Somehow, language is deposited in the world. It dwells amongst plants, herbs, stones, and animals. And the cabinet is defined by this pre-modern configuration of episteme, of the order of knowledge, by which the objects are exhibited to express another discourse that on its end remains secret and hidden, accessible only to another type of knowledge, the religious or mystical gnosis. So the type of nature that is studied really in the cabinet is a nature that is fragmented, parceled, and divided by an hermetic truth that bears on its surface the decipherable marks of the speech it contains. And the role of the cabinet is thus to identify this written truth that propagates amongst the collected objects, to understand the sequence of correspondences that organizes the superposition of this truth, its infinite frothiness in a way, to detect the network of resemblance and similitudes that binds this object to the cosmos. And so Aldrovandi's eye, this pre-modern eye looking at the world, always presupposes a triangulation of sorts, a triangulation between the eye of the observer, the observed object, and some kind of overhanging divine point of view located outside the world that constitutes at once its untouchable origin and its invisible vanishing point. So the pre-modern scientific knowledge in the cabinet looks at the capillarity of meaning among objects in a world which continuity is provided by the existence of God. And interestingly, when it comes to determining the epistemic status of natural objects, in other words, when it comes to determining where the objects speak from, this divine continuity is challenged by some disputes. And these disputes over the kind of speech carried by the objects is always of a cosmological nature. For example, Aldrovandi's cabinet is the stage amid naturalists of a true dispute over the epistemic status of two types of naturalia, the corals and the fossils. The coral obviously was a problematic category because for this pre-modern eye it appeared at the intersection of the animal, the vegetal and the mineral realms, and so it kind of mingled the threefold distinction that the cosmogony of the scriptures established between these three realms. So that coral, challenging the cosmogony of the scriptures, navigated for a while between few epistemic identities and thus got endowed with different echoes of this mystic proliferating truth. The fossil, this highly pixelated fossil, generated another dispute. The epistemic status of the fossil in Aldrovandi's natural history keeps indeed oscillating between two hypotheses. In Aldrovandi, the fossil is at once the product of geological pressure, for example, the negative form of a dead animal in ancient layers of the earth. But weirdly enough, it is also defined by Aldrovandi as the grace etched by the finger of God on the earth. So the result of some divine intervention that can only be significant in a non-human realm. So Aldrovandi's natural history appears also at this problematic moment in the scientific explanation of the world, where we gradually shift from what we could call geognosy. Geognosy is a knowledge of the earth in which the epistemic status is determined in a triangulation with the overhanging divine point of view. From geognosy to geology, which will be closer to our modern understanding of the discipline. And Aldrovandi is precisely the first one to coin the term geology in his natural history. And as such, his work anticipates and announces a gradual shift in the history of science, a shift from the mineralogical fetishism and geognostical fascination that we can see in the cabinets of curiosities to another type of cosmographical orientation, a new type of alliance or encounter between the objective world and language, meaning and speech, which leads me to the second point of this presentation, the mechanical revolution in the scientific explanation of the cosmos. In the first decades of the 17th century, with the technological acceleration and the apparition of new measuring instruments and data collection tools, such as the astronomical lens and the microscope, for example, a new geometrization of the world became possible. And this is traditionally called the mechanical revolution in science, and it consists in the series of events by which a shift happens in the production and the circulation of various new technologies that enabled the rather limited cognitive abilities of pre-scientific minds to become more regimented and to see at a glance a much wider array of facts and theories. So this cognitive and technological break is first and foremost an epistemological rupture. All the elements which were previously in pre-modern minds belonging to the underground or concealed in the thick interlacing of the world, hidden in some kind of shadow of mystic knowledge somehow, all these elements got gradually extracted and, so to speak, displaced on the side of the thematization of the represented, of the objective, of the elaborate, of the productible. And the first cosmological consequence of this epistemological rupture is what the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk claims in Spheres, is that modernity, by trying to study and explain what was previously considered as given, nature, air, atmosphere, culture, etc., modernity radically modified the nature of this given, so well that modernity can be regarded as the moment when the magic circle of God inclusive of everything, when this circle explodes and when the world gets fragmented and cut in categories of knowledge, in epistemic portions, and displayed in the modern cosmography of taxonomy. We could understand further maybe the new alliance between objects and language triggered by this mechanical revolution by isolating one event. In 1658, the Irish physicist and chemist Robert Boyle, thanks to a pneumatic machine he invented and that he called the vacuum chamber or air pump, managed to prove the existence of void in a sphere of glass by suffocating a bird. And this is a painting picturing the event made a century later by the English painter Joseph Wright of Derby. The cosmological and theological implications of the discovery of voids were huge, of course, because the fact that man could produce mechanically bubbles of absolute void in the world via processes of extraction and pressure pointed to the possibility for the divine jurisdiction, the source and scale of all things, to be absent of it, inaugurating the gradual withdrawal of God from the realm of experimental sciences. And this void, these suspensions of the law suspension of the laws governing the mundane environment of man could be seen as inaugurating the advent of modern sciences, because this void will be the founding principle of the laboratories of the 18th century, such as Lavoisier's workshop, for example. That is to say, neutral spaces dedicated to the auscultation of the world, emptied of the qualities that govern nature, in which the principles of the exterior world are, so to speak, suspended, interrupted, literally forming bubbles of void severed from nature in order to examine, at best, its intrinsic qualities. And modern sciences, in the wake of the mechanical revolution in the explanation of the world, enacted, among others, by Robert Boyle, engage with a logic of auscultation that is radically different from the one performed by men of learning in cabinets. The world on which the Enlightenment of 18th century will project its light is a world that is eroded, fragmented, striated by this void. It's a world that is contaminated from all sides by a new skepticism, the monstrous possibility that the world is not bound by mystic, secret knots. And the modern eye and all the prosthetic instruments of vision that it develops for itself, the microscope, the telescope, all the sets of lenses of glass that humans install between their eyes and the world, are dedicated to the examination of these new gaps that segment the world. The world examined by modern sciences is thus a world which knowledge cannot work only via mystical capillarities, by resemblances and similitudes, but that is, on the contrary, as once again Michel Foucault argued when he identified the shift from a classical knowledge to a modern one, a truth that is determined by fluctuating conditions of truth, in which language itself and all the modes of access to the world in general, language have a historical thickness and are the product of a stratification of sorts. And it's really in the strategic zone of this thickness, of this stratification, that the modern alliance between the production of visibilities and the technologies of the gaze that determine them, and the production of discursivities determined on their end by the epistemological status of the objects, the alliance between the objective world and signification is getting maybe more explicit. I could be clearer maybe by going back to our geognostical paradigm for a minute. The mechanical revolution has also triggered the gradual rise of powerful geognostical techniques for reading the underworld by means of hard evidence found on the surface. And from really geognosy we shift to geology. Instead of mystic continuities between the layers of the earth, we start specifying stratigraphic relations. And this shift could be summarized, I mean, it's my personal story, but I think it could be summarized by three events that have constituted true touchstones in the history of thought. In 1681, the English theologian Thomas Burnet publishes this, which is called The Sacred Theory of the Earth, a speculative cosmogony, a geognostical opus in which Burnet suggested that there was some kind of hollow earth with most of the water inside until Noah's flood, at which time mountains and oceans appeared. 6 years later, in 1687, Isaac Newton publishes his mathematical principles in natural philosophy, where basically he lays the foundations for most classical mechanics. Newton's laws of motion, with a set of concise and universal laws, have actually accomplished the very function of the astronomical lens. His laws have literally transformed the cosmos into some kind of meaningful space uniformly navigable by mathematical imagination. And conversely, it has made discovery and knowledge virtually infinite spaces. And the third event is in the middle of the 18th century. You have someone like James Hooden, a Scottish geologist called the philosopher of the fossils, who for the first time proposed in public and with geological evidences that Earth was a system much older than the common belief of 6,000 years old. Hooton pictured the Earth as a machine, a mechanical conception of the Earth that will trigger the first dispute in geology as a disciplinary field, a kind of dispute on the origin of the Earth between Plutonism and Neptunism. Two takes on the origin of the Earth. So this shift from geognosy to geology is a very strategic moment for the history of what we are looking at today, I think, because this geometry of alliance between objects and the narrative they produce, when you are interested in it, you realize that instantly you reach questions of a cosmological nature. And you can tell a basic story about the history of science by arguing that from 1600 to about 1780, throughout the encyclopedic projects, there is an enormous global project of inventory of plants, animals, and rocks. That new taxonomic borders are rising and appearing between objects, producing more immediate meaning for subjects, for humans, gradually escaping the storytelling of the scriptures. And in the case of geology, it's really at the beginning of the 18th century that this inventory that has been collected in cabinets is somehow specialized topographically in the new space of scientific observation and of systematic speculation on the becoming and the origin of the planet. And you can describe the history of geology as the history of the intersection between those geognostical preoccupation and a long tradition of cosmogonic preoccupation. And it's when the geognostic project becomes sufficiently sophisticated, in other words, when you get an adequate alliance of a geometry of prediction and the soil, that it enables you to get at cosmogonic questions using empirical data, and then begins really a science of geology. So this reconfiguration of the set of relations between man and its environment, its ground, has, of course, cosmological consequences. And here I talked about this modern contract under construction between things and words at the scale of geology and of the becoming of the planet. But interestingly, this new paradigm of extraction of hard evidence and their projection in a mechanist understanding of the world is very lively mirrored in an event that can stand for a historical anecdote, but that I will instrumentalize here as a kind of reversal of the lens to leave the cosmic scales of geology to zoom in the mechanisms of human brain. This event, which is an important moment for the history of medicine, is indeed the identification of the very first case of schizophrenia. James Tilly Matthews is an English tea broker who, concerned by the likelihood of a war between Britain and France, traveled to Paris during the terror that followed the French Revolution. Following that trip, Matthews got diagnosed with what was called at the time madness, and who retrospectively, thanks to the precise written description of his symptoms made by his doctor, got diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Matthews was convinced that outside the grounds of the psychiatric hospital where he was held, in a basement cellar in London, a gang of villains were controlling and tormenting his mind with diabolical rays. They were using a machine that Matthews called the air loom, not the air pump anymore, but the air loom, of which he was able to draw this fantastic technical diagram, and which combined recent developments in gas chemistry with the force, strange force of animal magnetism. It incorporated keys, levers, barrels, batteries, sails, brass retorts, and magnetic fluid, and worked by directing and modulating magnetically charged air currents. It ran on a mixture of weird substances, including spermatic animal seminal rays, effluvia of dogs, and putrid human breath. And its discharges of magnetic fluid were focused to deliver thoughts, feelings, and sensations directly into Matthew's brain. And there were many of these mind control settings, all classified by vivid names: fluid locking, stone making, tight talking, lobster cracking, bomb bursting, and the dreaded brain saying. Apparatuses whereby thoughts were forced into his brain against his will. And to facilitate the process, the gang of villains had implanted a magnet into Matthew's brain. The gang of the heirloom was led by a puppet master named Bill the King. All details were recorded by his second-in-command, Jack the Schoolmaster. The French liaison was accomplished by a woman called Charlotte, who seemed to Matthews to be as much a prisoner as himself, and who was appearing as being chained up and near naked. Sir Archie was a woman who dressed as a man and spoke in obscenities. And the machine itself was operated by the sinister, pockmarked, and nameless glove woman that is outside the image here. But all this activity wasn't directed solely at Matthews. There were many heirloom gangs all over London, influencing the minds of politicians and public figures. By poisoning the minds of politicians on both sides of the channel with paranoid brain sayings, they were threatening national and international catastrophes. So I think that here with the heirloom and with this beautiful diagram, we have the perfect geometrization of a space, a perceptual, cognitive, and political space, in which the perception of a situation is diagrammatically inscribed into a space of signification. And it's precisely if we understand schizophrenia as a dissociation between the real and the perceived, a disconnection between the objective reality and a way a self produces meaning from it, that maybe this story can start making sense in the framework of this conference. Current neurophysiology has suggested that a receptor in the hypothalamus called alpha-7, the nicotinic receptor, enables the brain to perform distinctions between foreground and background sounds, between unintentional patterns such as noise and intentional sounds carrying meaning and framing attention such as speech. Recent scientific research shows that breakdowns in the neurotransmission across this receptor may be partly responsible for schizophrenic symptoms, such as hearing voices emanating from sonic sources that are normally ignored, radiators, air vents, ambient noise, etc. To say it differently, it's via this neuroreceptor that schizophrenia produces meaningful figures, spaces of signification, from a ground of objects that do not call for any attention with the subject, with the self. And as Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari argue in their book Anti-Oedipus, the first volume of their wider project on capitalism and schizophrenia, the object of the schizophrenic delirium is never personal. It never has to do with an intimate space or confidential history. The object of the delirium of the schizophrenic is always of a political, institutional, geopolitical nature. And because schizophrenia is just a glitch in what the philosophers call the connection between desiring machines, and because these desiring machines are mechanical links between the interiority of the subject and the exterior world, the schizophrenic delirium simply draws a kind of geodesic arc between the subject and a fantasized world that always consists in the biggest possible frame. To go back to the diagram of the heirloom, I think that the vertiginous conspiracies in Euclidean spaces it depicts or the perfect image of the geometry of knowledge triggered by the constitution of the modern scientific mind. The epistemological breaks produced by the new instruments of modern sciences, by making the world legible, have triggered a new orientation in the world. A new orientation that imprints, as we've seen, great divides between objects of knowledge. But ultimately, the major break, the great meridian of modernity, is imprinted between objects and subjects, between the objective world and the modern human figure. These separations, we could call them lines of schizophrenia. The examination of these new gaps that segment the world, made possible by these new lenses and these new instruments of visions brought by the mechanical revolution. This examination has implicitly produced a new gaze projected on the world, a new cognitive agency between the objective world and our manifest or scientific perception of it. So well that we can say that this scientific mind constantly faces epistemological separations. It constantly faces decisions between categories. It faces great divides. It faces the great meridians in the topography of knowledge. Therefore, the scientific mind is always put in a stereoscopic or schizophrenic position. To determine the epistemic status of an object, it has to make a decision. It must decide to see the object from the side of the subjectivity of the observer or from the objectivity of the observed, following an either-or logic. And in this configuration, making an epistemic decision means to deepen a line of schizophrenia in order to purify the realms it divides. So I don't want to make any kind of historical shortcuts here, and I wouldn't want to say that schizophrenia is the product of scientific revolution, of course not. But I want to point out that the recording, the clinical conviction of Matthew's madness as being paranoid schizophrenia is, let's say, an apparition in the symbolical and epistemological horizon of the 18th century, an apparition that is directly linked to the mechanical revolution in the scientific explanation of the world. And from this event in the history of medicine, I'd like to go deeper in this contract between objects and language a third and last time. From the cosmological consequences of stratigraphic cuts imprinted in the earth to the mechanisms of schizophrenia in the brain, industrial revolution and the Enlightenment have produced a series of processes that are primarily the result of what Michel Foucault once more calls a clinical gaze. The clinic can indeed be regarded as the demon of the modern institutions of knowledge and as the side of a particular graft, a transplant, that of speech on objects. In the field of science, the 18th century is, as the two historians of science, Lorraine Daston and Peter Galison, have argued in their book Objectivity, 18th century is a time of invention of new techniques of objectivity. That is to say, scientific instruments and methodologies of representation of objects that, before the invention of photography and film, have consisted in real tools of epistemological conviction. These tools intended to provide science with new modes of slicing of the world in epistemic portions, in order to reconstitute the world as an atlas, that is to say, a thematic map of the objective world crossed out by surgical excisions, defining epistemological separations between objects. In the light of this, Enlightenment can be read as an enterprise of purification of inherited Western epistemologies, a logic of borders construction between subjective perception and objective qualities, between the colloquial perception of the real and the merely fictive or imaginary, and last but not least, between interior self and exterior world. This new search for the epistemic virtue of things by way of objectivity is parallel to the apparition of the central instrument of modernity, the modern museum. The instrument that will provide this objectivity with a specific institution of conservation, a specific site of display, a specific technology of the gaze, once more. Like many modern spaces of observation, explanation, and conservation of artifacts, the logic of extraction and of exhibition at work in the museum performs in the life of the object another clinical operation, a dialectical operation that desanimates animated entities and reanimates dead objects. This is an image of the cabinet of birds of the Museum of Natural History of Paris. As many museum spaces dedicated to the natural, it's an immaculate physical condensation of a world of inert matter, objectively organized through a static taxonomy. The fixed type of taxonomy that generally correlates to the natural, a certain notion of time that organizes the museum by way of history. So what's going on here? It seems that a double capture is happening in this object, and this double capture is of a highly clinical nature. The extraction of the animal from the natural world and its inscription in the taxonomy of the museum is something we could call a denaturalizing cut. This cut is simultaneously the institution of an enclosure around the animal, the display cabinet, and the isolation inside the animal of an object of knowledge, the animal figure. This denaturalizing cut by which is instituted the scientific objectivation in the Museum of Natural History somehow slices and cuts out specific milieu in the whole body of nature. It isolates the milieu red-legged honey creeper from the milieu white-throated sparrow, for example, the milieu common yellowthroat from the milieu northern parula, etc., and so forth, and so on. It purifies this milieu by deleting all the fields of real or symbolical mediations and relations that existed between these entities in nature. And this slicing in nature culminates somehow in a fixation, a capture. And the modern museum is defined by this fundamental contradiction of this moment of capture. And we could define this contradiction as follows. The intensification of the discontinuity between the world of the animal and the world of man, discontinuity that reaches its pinnacle through its materialization in display cabinets, panes of glass, cages and walls. This discontinuity is precisely that which allows a new form of continuity, namely the integration of the animal figure in the world of the moderns and in the specific temporality of their observation of nature in the modern cosmography of taxonomy. And here the museum is like a park crossed out by limits, limits between species, between categories, and above all between human and non-humans. And a space dedicated to the conservation of the figures that are circumscribed by these limits. And somehow the Museum of Natural History is an epistemological mirror that reflects an image of nature made of limits and borders between objects of knowledge. And as such, the Museum of Natural History, in many of its aspects, meets what Michel Foucault identified at the origin of the modern institutions of knowledge, and that he called obscure gestures. These obscure gestures define the ambivalence of the mechanisms buried at the deep of the great divides performed by scientific modernity. And this is how we could summarize Foucault's description of the logic of these obscure gestures. The categorical and epistemological separations performed in the world by scientific modernity sharply slice through the network of contextual relations and symbolical exchanges these entities maintain with their natural milieu, by inscribing around them breakpoints via the work of objectivation, the work of isolation and identification of factual truth. Therefore, this separation creates some kind of silent space, the space of an exchange that is put to death. And it's in these silent spaces, these clinical spaces made of breakpoints, that Foucault localized the apparition of the institutions of modern knowledge: museums, laboratories, archives, clinics, psychiatric hospitals, zoological gardens, prisons, etc. And for Foucault, the institution manages and administers the epistemological divide of which it is the product. For example, the mental clinic is the product of the identification of a line between sane and insane people. And it administers this limit. It applies the consequence of this line on subjects, on people. And for example, the Museum of Natural History manages and exhibits the borders in the natural realm, and it is itself also the product of these borders. So I think that for us today, what is important to understand in Foucault's obscure gestures is what it says of a modern institution like the museum. The property of the institution is to be a technology of the gaze that duplicates the separation of which it is the result at all the levels of scales and scales of knowledge. It's a space that reproduces the micro-cuts in the world at a macro level, like an accelerator or amplifier for separations. The architecture of classification in which consists the Museum of Natural History is the expression of this principle, by which the separation must go through each subject moving in it, pass inside each body going through the apparatus, implant itself in the eye of each spectator scanning the objectified natural world. And this is where I think, at least for me, I think we get to the bottom of this entanglement between visibilities and discursivities, in which the technologies of exhibition are absolutely central. The French philosopher Bruno Latour, in his project of Anthropology of Modern Sciences, argues that scientific objectivation, such as the one that the Museum of Natural History operates, is a tool of purification. It produces an immediated world made exclusively of objective representation, and as such it calls for new technologies, new instruments, new chains of synthetic reference aimed at inhabiting this silent space, this world emptied from its symbolic mediators, aimed in a way at creating new associations between the observer and the observed. In this case here, the synthetic mediation is provided by all the infrastructure of the museum, all the technical elements, pedestals, panes of glass, taxidermy, display cabinets, etc. All elements that make of the modern institution a true technology of vision. For Latour, these new mediators are what he calls grafts. They are modes of inscription by which the activity of objectivation of nature allows one to immobilize referents that make things talk. The isolators for objects, in which consist the museum, the modern institutions of conservation, the sites of knowledge, the archives, the museums, they work as the expression of these graphs. They are writing machines by which the power of inscription of scientific objectivation gives the object the power of speech, by making them explicit, by making them legible, loquacious, and talkative in a way. The objectivation of the natural material that is operated by the Museum of Natural History is put in tension by this power of inscription. By rendering the object mute, the clinical operation of objectivation provides it with the ability to signify, to be inhabited by a synthetic voice, to be the mouthpiece of the species of the category of which it is the figure. And in clinical terms, this is a graft, a transplant of sorts, that of a synthetic tongue on the object. And remember our case of schizophrenia, we are very close here. The function of the clinical gesture of objectivation is to rescue the object from its muteness, to replace it with the sum of meaning of which it is the promise. And the function of the museum is to ceaselessly inscribe perception into a geometrical space of signification. So from the cosmic magnitude of geognosy to the inner mechanisms of schizophrenia, from the rise of new epistemological borders to their translation in apparatuses of exhibition that consist in technologies of the gaze, how can we wrap up these stories I told? Well, it's Walter Benjamin, the thinker of the end of history in the age of the rise of the technological paradigm, who can provide us with a concept, shedding a new light on the entanglement of objects and speech. Benjamin's book One Way Street, written in 1928, ends with a short text titled To the Planetarium that describes in a prophetic tone how the tools the moderns developed have actually consisted in technologies, quote, of intercourse with the cosmos, revealing that the concept of nature against which the rationalist and universalist mind had posited its action and its thoughts was actually what we can understand as the long construction of a cosmic optical apparatus, a planetarium. The planetarium basically reveals nature as a purely artificial entity, an artifact, the mere backdrop of man's existence, the background unified and solidified by technology, allowing the exception of the modern human figure in the world. And as such, the planetarium is the space by which human thought has been bound to the world, through a space dedicated to visibility, a space of light and revelation, allowing the historic becoming of man, and in which, for example, works of art were opening, like the stars here, were openings towards the outside in the starry night of the moderns. Thus, the planetarium is the other name of the modern teleonomic space of reason. And what's useful in the Benjaminian concept of planetarium is that maybe it helps us to understand that the speech-object relationship we are talking about and the episteme that constitutes its relationship has constituted the epistemological horizon of the modern space of reason, and that this relationship, this reflexive agency by which man extracts himself from nature, is merely an organization of space. First and foremost, a system of orientation in the cosmos. The planetarium that Benjamin announces could be understood as the moment when all the clinical gestures, all the denaturalizing cuts, all the epistemological borders that have contributed to map nature, when all these gestures come to stand for nature. The moment when the epistemological horizon of the moderns comes to fold onto itself, that the modern circumnavigation of nature comes to morph in geodesic curves enclosing the human figure inside its own modes of access to nature. The moment when the map becomes the territory, in a way. And to be faithful to Benjamin's optical concept, we should employ the notion of perspective, so fundamental to a modern rationalist organization of space, and quotes the Brazilian anthropologist Vivero de Castro, who says that a perspective is not a representation, because representations are a property of the mind or spirit, whereas the point of view is located in the body. In other words, a point of view and the peculiar corporal circumstances that enable it doesn't create an object, it creates a subject, the modern subject. And so this perspective is what has been, towards the planetarium, animating the modern expansive gaze, this gaze directed outwards and into the unknown. And this is maybe the image that could illustrate best this expansive gaze. It's the frontispiece of a map of the El Dorado, drawn by the English explorer Sir Walter Raleigh in 1595, the year Ulysse Aldrovandi published his natural history. And I found it in a book describing his attempt to find the mythic Golden City, a book called The Creator in the Map, which is obviously what is represented here. The oceans in the map of these first explorers were peopled by what they called axiomatic monsters, landmarks in the unknown, aquatic snakes and oceanic griffins, chimera of sorts, the same kind of chimera Aldrovandi kept reproducing in his natural history. And the first conquistadors had already, at that time, given a name to that moment when they had overcome these monsters and when they reached the terra incognita. They called this moment, when they reached their goal, an entrada. Entrada was a term coined by these first European transatlantic explorers to qualify the stake of their travel, a journey where you left the margins, the settled, the known, and made your entrance into that unmapped interior where just about anything was possible. And as such, Entrada was the name of this vanishing point of the modern space of reason. So well that Entrada and Planetarium are two kind of symmetrical motifs that name what modernity has been. That is to say, the establishment and the expansion of a world interior whose boundaries are invisible, yet virtually insurmountable. And so I'd like to finish on this idea of entrada and leave that to you as a question. Now that the human expansive gaze has mapped the entirety of the planet, now that the work of extraction of the human figure is achieved in the post-historic world, now that we have entered the planetarium and that the map is the territory, and now that politically we face the systemic becoming of clinical gestures, where the question of separation seems to happen in more and more clinical spaces. The question is really, when we deal with spaces of purification, such as the exhibition space, where the orientation of objects towards knowledge seems to be given, the question is really to know whether new types of entrada are possible or not, and maybe to invent new ways to navigate in the space of reason. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Rupa Krishnan, and I'm a mouth. More specifically, I'm a mouth possessing an uncanny ability to contort itself, and my contortions are specific. Behind spit screens and condenser microphones, I'm invisible, but all the more present. I produce, but I don't write. I enunciate the copy, but it's not transparency. No, it's effect that I effectively produce. I use unseen facial expressions, muscle movements, tongue positions, bones, air, throat and voice box maneuvers to manipulate information, bending, warping and morphing the provided script for hire. This is one such script. Imagine a Cheshire cat smiling. I'm sometimes a smile that speaks, but then again, you don't see me at all. I'm wholly non-diegetic. Let's say I can sound like a smile. I can become a grimace by producing the voice of a grimace in order to produce the menace required by the content. I arrive through speakers or headphones, disembodied, dislocated. I embody an atmosphere. I locate a honed, directed, and overly considered message in a certain tonal dialect. Codified cues, sibilant symbols, signs. Affect, inflect, infect. Whatever. It's what they tell me to say, sure, but it's how I say it that is telling. In the end, it's my voice you hear, and how I say it is content. Of course, to speak, I breathe out. My breath then travels upwards to my larynx, which is located here in my throat. Tiny muscles in my larynx bring my vocal cords closer together. My breath hits these vocal folds and they vibrate. However, my voice is not yet a voice. In that instance, it's just a vibration. But that buzzing is amplified by the resonating cavities in my mouth and the upper portion of my throat. So, as the bones of my skull and other parts of my body vibrate, the sound is enhanced. I shape all of this into words with my articulators, lips, soft palate, and my tongue. The shape, size, mechanics, and motion of all this combines into my own unique voice, though I've learned to alter mine to supplant theirs. It's how I say it that is telling. I do a lot of it with my tongue, and the tongue is something I'll be talking about this evening. Or it's a diving board for a larger conversation. It's going to get a bit dry, so let's consider the odd crustacean parasite known as Cymothoa exigua, also known as the tongue-eating louse. Entering through a fish's gills, this parasite attaches itself at the base of the fish's tongue. Extracting blood, the parasite causes the fish's tongue to atrophy from lack of blood, allowing the parasite to attach its own body to the muscles of the fish's tongue stub and effectively replace its host's tongue. While the inhabited fish continues to use its tongue as before, the fish tongue is no longer a tongue exactly, but a functional prosthesis and a hybrid organism. That the tongue specifically is the site of the struggle and is also a key muscle of human speech has symbolic significance when considering the many discursive and informational modes of parasitical practice, as does the verb form of the word louse, which tellingly means to ruin or spoil. So, you may have gathered I'll be talking about parasites, and later on you will hear me say, in every case of parasitical practice, the first question is, who is parasiting whom? First, who is speaking? I am speaking, yes, but not as myself. It's a concentric voice here, one that carries in it a process of deferral. Wit, an institution, and down a selection chain to an external operative, who invited an external operative, who requested me, and who invited another external operative with whom he co-authored much of the copy I will deliver. A Productive Irritant, Parasitical Inhabitations in Contemporary Art by Chris Fitzpatrick and Post Brothers was edited by Christina Lee Podesva and published in the fall 2011 issue of Philip, issue number 15. In its first textual form, it was obscenely long, intentionally constructed as a parasite to burrow into the journal and thereby follow the form and operations of its subject. In other words, it was 12,000 words, with another 3,000 in the footnotes. So, I am the one speaking, but I'm talking with my mouth full. Why am I talking? I'm not a parrot, or a lyrebird, or a chainsaw, or a ventriloquist. I'd need my hands for that, and a prop, but that's outside my line. I'm a mouth, and I don't believe the dummy is the real means of a ventriloquist's distractions. It's more that they cover the coming problematic word preemptively with another word, lightly mangled, and long before the word needing real mangling to avoid getting caught with tricks has been spoken. That slow trip mangling keeps suspicious eyes off manipulative lips and the throat, and all of that allows the ear to suspend the slur. The dummy lives. We don't have gills. Which came first, the intestine or the tapeworm? I read about a man who had a living lump in the back of his head. It turned out that a botfly had burrowed eggs beneath his scalp. They started to move. He stopped sleeping. The noise in his skull was terrible. Sores, pain, doctors, confusion. Eventually, a doctor realized there were insects living beneath his scalp, and they were surgically removed before the botflies could... sorry. Let me recount something a bit less grotesque. About another man, but where the man is the parasite, and a well-known institution is the scalp. In 1969, Harvey Stromberg walked into the Museum of Modern Art, New York, with a notebook, measuring tape, and a camera. Posing as a student, he returned on a regular basis, pretending to study the museum's collection when, in fact, he was surreptitiously measuring and photographing various features inside and outside the museum. After printing over 300 photographs of light switches, keyholes, bricks, air vents, and so on, Stromberg attached his photos to the wall, floors, and other surfaces subtly and without authorization from the institution. Stromberg confused what the institution had sanctioned and what it had not. He inhabited the museum as a foreign agent, adopting tactics that offered practical and conceptual strategies of artistic production and exhibition through acts of what I'd like to refer to as parasitical inhabitation. By the way, a parasite is usually defined as an organism that lives in or on another organism, extracting what it needs from its host without giving anything positive in exchange. So when artists are working parasitically, context, the site, its history, its claims to authority, its funding and organizational structures, and its habits, is perhaps the primary material being occupied and consumed. It's what they tell me to say, sure, but it's how I say it that is telling. The script keeps telling me to say that, which is annoying. Anyways, when the script's author, or more accurately authors, speak of parasitical practices in art, they recognize the fact that they owe quite a lot to the work of French polymath Michel Serres. In 1980, Serres wrote a book called The Parasite. In it, he thinks about parasites as vehicles for introducing irritants to any given order, causing subtle changes that can be productive and cumulative. In particular, they were drawn to how Serres broke down the three uses for the word parasite: the biological parasite, the social parasite, and the parasite as communicative, static, derived from the French word for noise, parasite. For Serres, these linguistic significations are not distinct, but interrelated. Parasitism is not merely antagonistic. Its disruptions are indicative of complex, yet fundamental relations between people and between things, sentient or not. Throughout Serres's discussion, these three conceptions of parasites operate neither as autonomous nor distinct entities. There exists always a level of static in social relations. There are always disturbances in bodies, and there is always a loss in any act of exchange, but also something gained. The figure of the parasite extends to artists a means of surveying, articulating, questioning, and contaminating relations, a tool to determine loopholes, interdependencies, differences, and positions within effective relations. The parasite becomes an expert in its host's patterns and can then subvert and redirect them. Through parasitic tactics, an artist can exhibit his or her work anywhere, at any time, without being invited. Artists can inhabit the institution, physically, or take over its figurative voice, literally. Today, we don't have time for 12,000 words. At about 100 words per minute, I'd be talking for an eternity. I'm halfway done, so one other thing before I get on with it. Fitzpatrick and Post didn't intend to suggest a canon of parasitical practice, nor a comprehensive survey. They're into aliens. They're interested in parasites for how their presence brings about responses, how certain implicated foundations can become productive for change, how certain infiltrations by those routinely excluded can interrupt the status quo, how specific hosts call for precise maneuvers, how an outside operator's ability to intrude and use the system's nomenclature can divulge an infrastructure's integral aspects. If the word parasite is almost always a pejorative, it is perhaps because the parasite's identity is contingent on it being a nuisance, a stranger to the host despite their intimacy. When individuals ingest roundworms to lose weight, for instance, does this willing introduction of the parasite negate its harmful potential? And how does the act of voluntary bloodletting change a patient's relation to the leech when that leech is put in service to medicine? What do the processes of regulation, invitation, and control therefore render? Back to Serres. The guest can disgrace and abuse the charity of a host. Parasites and their targets renegotiate their positions when confronting or when confronted by one another. Of course, the host can also abuse the guest, but there can also be intermediaries who add further complexity to the field of relations. Thinking back to that scalp, the word parasite elicits an image of a forceful invader penetrating the body of the host or sneaking in through the host's day-to-day activities. For example, there's this Amazonian freshwater parasitic catfish known as the candiru. Until recently, its disturbing behavior has, for the most part, existed only in legends and fiction. Reports of candiru's attacks date back to the late 19th century, but the first documented case of the candiru parasitizing humans was only in 1997. The fish penetrated the victim's urethra while he was standing in the river urinating. It actually emerged from the water, traveled up the urine stream, and entered the man's penis, filling the entire anterior urethra. If the candiru can enter into a closed body through the organism's system of exclusion, the surplus waste that the host wishes to dispel, then parasitical artists can use whatever technical systems or apparatuses they can find to enter into their targets' bodies through excesses, drawing on the host's output, energy supplies, and cycles. As Seth Price attests, production, after all, is the excretory phase in a process of appropriation. 2. Cymothoa exigua, the tongue-eating louse. Earlier, I mentioned the tongue-eating louse. It presents a model for the possibilities and problems raised when an artist appropriates the figurative tongue or voice of a targeted institution. It also introduces heightened potential for artists to be instrumentalized by the institution, used, in reverse, as the mouthpiece of its target, and thus reduced to yet another vehicle for the language and operations of the host. Those operations of Cymothoa exigua yield questions concerning the codes and formats of institutional address, the role of parasitical noise in communication, and the interconnected relationship between the host and parasite. We are moving on from candiru towards gestures of inhabiting the tongue, which can frustrate power positions and expose the tenuous authority of the institution's language. Inhabiting the tongue makes clear to the host not only that its own voice can be appropriated, but also that its authoritative communication is neither objective nor indifferent. I have some examples. For the collective Bank's Faxback project, started in 1998, Bank collected and edited publicity materials issued by galleries, commenting on the grammar, content, tone, form, and style of the texts directly onto the press releases. Bank then faxed the documents its members altered back to the galleries that issued them and later exhibited these documents. Bank sabotaged each institution's rhetoric by mirroring its voice and occupying its physical circuits of transmission. Ultimately, Bank's interventions showed press releases to be inflated advertisements masquerading as critical commentary and contextualization. Bank forced galleries to rethink the language they employed and the curatorial and programmatic choices they made, as well as the images they projected of themselves and their artists. Bank showed the mechanism of dissemination as the primary material, site, and receptacle for events and ideas. A slower, parallel stream. Today, discursive and promotional channels are often confused as equivalent means of mediation. When Dexter Sinister were invited to participate in the 2008 Whitney Biennial, they produced and released press releases, logos, retypeset versions of texts, essays, archival documents and memos, email exchanges, a loose chapter of a novel, re-released magazine articles, book releases, and an alternative audio guide for navigating the biennial. Whereas Bank intercepted official communications, altered them, and then rerouted them back to their sources, Dexter Sinister joined the publicity office in a sense, distributing a very different stream of information designed to expand and slow rather than contract and expedite the superficial conclusions the biennial usually disperses through these channels. Dexter Sinister introduced forms of communication and noise in order to examine the ways in which information is released and distributed. Turning again to Ceres, his parasites are eating him up, and their noise covers his voice. Static is a paramount model for the parasite's intercession into the exchange of information. Both Dexter Sinister and Bank introduce a direct correlation between the intensity of activity on the channel and the communication of the message. Or let's think about the yes men. When they assume the semblances of other entities, it grants them access to sites or contexts that are otherwise inaccessible, such as television programs, closed-door conventions, and other speaking engagements. Whereas Bank intervened in the communications of others, the yes men actually communicate as others. They pose as particular people or invent representatives of existing companies. The yes men, camouflaged, become an institution's mouthpiece. The yes men's Andy Bickelbaum posed as a spokesman of Dow Chemical on BBC on the 20th anniversary of the 1984 Union Carbide chemical spill in Bhopal, India. Bickelbaum announced that Dow Chemical, the company that took over Union Carbide, was finally taking full responsibility for the disaster, in which at least 20,000 people died and thousands more were made sick. Dow Chemical stock lost value temporarily, and surely many victims were disheartened after BBAC later notified viewers of the hoax, but as Carrie Lambert Betty writes, for those 2 hours, the world believed that there would be something like justice in Bhopal. For that time, there existed a different model for corporate decision-making, an ethical as well as financial bottom line. The yes-men stand in for their hosts, making them accountable, speaking for them, as them, because the hosts refuse to do so. The yes-men's uncanny ability to transform, with the aid of a business suit, into their host is a type of parasitical ventriloquism that forces the host to enunciate against its will or even without its knowledge. The symbolic pronouncements articulated in bureaucratic documents regulate the movements, behavior, and self-identification of subjects. In the flow of detached bureaucratic exchange, there are often hiccups or mistakes that defer the normal passage of information. On October 5, 2007, the artist Kristen Lucas officially changed her name from Kristen Sue Lucas to Kristen Sue Lucas in the Superior Court of California in Oakland. To refresh her identity, Lucas petitioned the court in the standard procedure. It was eventually granted, but involved significant deliberation because Lucas put statutory procedure into a feedback loop. She forced administrators into a double take of the system they invest in and maintain. Her deference to the legal system is both crediting the government with more power than it actually has and tacitly raising the question of whether, in fact, the judge has the authority to grant a new lease on life. Lucas entered, irritated, and provoked the mouthpiece of the system to question its own regimes philosophically and, in doing so, forced the court's voice, the judge, to not only acknowledge but to accept and participate in her existential change. So, this is the longest trailer I've ever read. It offers some preview, or in this case, review of a much longer text with a much more constructed form than this. Introduction, case studies threaded into chapters using parasites as models or thought shapes. One that swims into a urethra through urine, another that swims in through gills to occupy the place of a fish's tongue, and a third parasitical example that lives in cats and circulates through their excrement to be ingested by their prey after eating that excrement, which modifies their behavior to make them easier targets for the prey, and the parasite completes its loop. I didn't just walk in the door and interrupt. I was invited. And I'm reading a script, which was also written by invitation and contains within it other invitations. So I'm not sure why my mouth is necessary. As one voice capable of many, I am perhaps well suited to enunciate many voices collated into the semblance of one. Perhaps the point in all of this is that what makes a project parasitical is not only that it enters and feeds off a system, but that through its interruption, the project lays bare the parasitical interrelations within the system itself. These component relationships are what parasites feed on. Parasites exploit systems of exploitation, interfering with perceived balances by deferring the normal route. While parasites are dependent on the context in which they operate, theirs is a game of asserting their presence in the host while distracting the system's mechanisms. Even when invited into the dominant field of discourse, the parasite asserts itself as a stranger, one who recognizes not only the hidden pacts of hospitality and property, but also how the host is a position that can be displaced. Parasites tell us much about their hosts and the systems in which those hosts operate. But what is parasitism exactly? Is it a strategy of convenience? An operational channel for riding the waves of communication to exploit scale and power? Does the parasite identify with its host? Is its embeddedness an empathetic gesture towards identification or belonging? What is at stake in a parasitic action? What happens when roles are inverted and dependencies revealed? Does the parasite reflect an impasse where change is only conceivable from the inside? What can the parasite tell us about interdependencies? The intimate yet poisonous interaction between parasite and host surely provides a more nuanced way of charting exploitation. But does interrupting binary models of abuse allow for identification between others? Or does it wipe away the problems between them? Does the parasite offer a model for the host that recognizes and evolves through intrusion? Can an institution be built that reveres and learns from the parasite without making it one of its own? Is the parasite contagious? Can subtle interruptions in specific spaces affect broader shifts? When projects bring external or marginalized voices into the institution, is their inclusion just a simple use of a middleman so that the institution does not have to confront its own exclusions? In every case of parasitical practice, the first question is, who is parasiting whom? Everyone is parasiting everyone, always. How parasites shift according to certain rules and how their hosts must shift according to their parasites is the very point of parasitic gestures. It is how parasitic gestures become more than gestures. It is how they effect change.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chris and Vincent, for two very distinctive but super interesting presentations. Both actually walk us through many issues and questions with scientific and biological models and examples. And I guess the central topic here is actually the question of institution, not just question of museums or art context, but this whole broader idea of institution and how we actually question the structure of institution. So that would be my little sort of reflection on that. I guess I would love to open it to the audience for questions.
I think it was very clear. No one has any questions.
Or any interventions?
I think this model of the parasite, yeah, it's something that's been used in many formats, as you've said. And I've always, playing the devil's advocate, I've always wondered how, because for me this seems like a gesture of arrestation. Like you said, you can reveal certain things. And I'm wondering how this can start to affirm those changes, or what those changes would be as a result of parasitic activity. So to go to the next step to affirm what that new recognition might be.
Well, yeah. It all, like I said, it all comes from this article that we wrote for Philip magazine, or for Philip, the journal Philip. And there's 3 sections, and in a lot of them, we talk about different kinds of parasitical models. So one of the reasons that we kind of advocate for this is that you have someone like, let's say, André Cadre, for example, who finds a way to sort of bypass the entire art system and just enter into any situation that he wants. He's not dependent upon the art system, because it's also fine to just go out onto the street and present his work. That's one case. At the same time, he go into Daniel Buren's exhibition and present his work at that opening, and then parasite off of the attendance of all the people that are coming to Buren. So in that sense, there's, in each of these parasitical examples, of course, I mean, it's supposed to be taken with a lot of humor as well. I mean, parasite is such a pejorative word that to call artists that, it just has to be prefaced that there's that we know that it's a kind of joke also to say that. But it is quite easy to look through the biological world and find all kinds of interesting models that can be applied. It is a value judgment to say whether or not these things are very effective, but I think for just in the cases that I spoke about today, the ones that weren't edited out, you know, Stromberg was able to exhibit in the Museum of Modern Art, but he wasn't invited. Dexter Sinister was able to not only interact with the information that was being distributed from the Whitney Biennial, but also to comment on that and to sort of make a statement and have a stance related to the sort of expectation that all things have to be, you know, immediate. I mean, maybe these photographs right now are going onto Facebook, I don't know. And we also document everything in our space. We all do this now. And so I think that they were trying to sort of take things and almost clog the channel. So that's another example of a case where it's effective. Or if you look at the Yes Men example, it's amazing because, you know, that news station didn't know that Andy Bickelbaum was the actual person that they were talking to. And so then they have to go back and they have to check, you know, what are we doing, how are we operating? And they have to sort of, that news station and all news stations from that have to sort of look back at, you know, what kind of choices or what kind of level of seriousness are they having to the news, you know, if they're in the business of the news. And then the other example was, what's the first example? Well, in any case, does that answer your question? I mean, it's on a case-by-case basis, and it's on a model-by-model basis, really. I mean, I sort of allude to them at the end that there were these three models that are in the text. One being one that's a sort of forceful invasion without invitation, one that's a kind of inhabitation of the voice of an institution, whether that's you know, Robin Whitlaw going into a museum and stealing the audio tape and putting her own tapes in, which then have a completely different message, and it takes a few weeks before they notice that that's happened. And then in the third one, it's more about the kind of the really, really complex nature of relations themselves is always being much more complicated than they seem. And that was a bit what interests me in doing this kind of a project here, was that there's so many amazing people that are involved coming from so many different places, and there's all these different relations that are happening. So it seemed like a means to sort of think about not only the questions that were raised by the conference, but perhaps even sort of try to enact those things at the same time.